Hey, this is Phoebe from Quilted Pig, and today we're going to talk about the scale of the design on your fabric and how that works on your quilt. I've got some quilts here that I have pieced over the years. Some were very successful in my opinion, and others were maybe. But let's talk about them and why this scale makes a difference. This first one is a pattern that I've done several times. It takes 2-inch strips, and then these are 4-inch squares. So the goal of the pattern itself, even though color-wise this one may not have been successful, the goal of the pattern itself was to have the fabric that the squares are floating on be a small enough print that as it looks together, they look like they're floating. You don't see where a small cut would happen and do that across. That kind of thing doesn't show up. And then the actual squares themselves appear to be floating on the top, other than, the color's kind of a situation on this one. But this one is actually the first one that I made of this pattern, and it's actually one of my very first quilts that I ever made. Again, it's got a very small motif, small little morning glories. They kind of mesh together as they go along, and the vines that go through them mesh together. The squares appear to be floating on the quilt. Now, something like this, we need a small scale print for this. If you look at different prints, perhaps some from my stash, here's one that is almost too big. Compared in size to this size flower, which are less than a half an inch, this size, they're more like an inch, and they're almost too big. If I go and slice that into bits, you'd be able to see like where it cuts the flower off, and it wouldn't necessarily look good. But this would be about the biggest I would go. You look at these bunnies right here, and those are definitely too big for this kind of scale. And as another example, think about these large poppies. This fabric is beautiful. Gosh, I love it. I still haven't found the perfect place to use it. Because it is such a large scale, it really needs to be a focus print within a quilt, and it would not be great for this type of pattern. But let's go ahead and talk about another pattern where you can use a big scale, you can use a small scale, and you can even mix them up a little bit. Here is a different pattern. Also, I've got a couple of samples to show you. Now, this one uses both large scale. This pink is technically a fairly large diamond fabric, and then it also uses some small to medium scale. It's got some very just solid, some that looks washed, some batiks. All of those things mix, and again, even though the colors are a little bit garish, the scale of the fabrics themselves actually meshes well, and it gives you a good variety of things. Here's one, same pattern, done with not so wild fabrics, that uses actually several from the same line as well as some that I added in. So you have some extremely small dots here, followed by some small flowers and things like that. You've got jacks. These are starting to, as far as for this grouping of fabrics go, these are starting to get into the medium size. You've got some medium-sized dots. Now consider if we were to use this fabric in a quilt like the ones that I just showed you, if I were to cut this into those 2-inch pieces, some pieces would have these daisies, others would have circles. It just wouldn't be the same. Same thing with these larger flowers here. But on this quilt, because the blocks themselves, the actual cut pieces are bigger, you can see the full design of those. Now I want to show you an example of a pattern that I originally thought was going to look great with a certain fabric, and now since preparing for this video, I think I've decided on something else. This is a really cute pattern that I bought several years ago. It's called French Rosebuds. It's a beautiful raw edge applique pattern. And so when I purchased the pattern, I also purchased this fabric for it. So I have this really super cute yellow with little fairy girls. And then I had a pink and a blue. And these are both small scale prints. And then I had this peach color that in person it reads as almost a solid, but when I looked on my camera, you can actually see the little designs going on it, which I thought was pretty too. However, as I was looking at my pattern, I looked at it and realized that you don't see any large portion of the rows at any one time. So if I'm going through here and cutting this to make these little French rosebuds, I think the biggest one is maybe 5 inches. If I'm going through and cutting that, some of these girls are going to lose their heads. And so I didn't like that. So I looked at this one. Now again, this is the same as that hot pink that I showed you a minute ago, and it has these bigger diamond shapes. However, it's very muted. It's very low volume, so that when I put it together, the scale isn't going to be so important. Versus these little fairy ladies, if their heads are chopped off and stuff, they lose some of their cuteness, but I still think it's a darling fabric. Now I wanted to show you a few examples of scale that maybe wasn't quite as successful as others. This is from actually a kit that I purchased, and even though I love, 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 love the colors, I just, yeah, this tone is really pretty. Some of the fabrics in the kit just really weren't a good scale. So if you look at, like most of it, you look through this and there are a smaller scale of flowers, smaller scale, a different kind of scratchy looking print, small paisleys, things like that. But then there are some where the flowers are actually so large that they've been cut up by putting them into the blocks. This also is kind of a low volume quilt, and so it really doesn't bother me. I think it's beautiful, and someday I'll get around to quilting it. But I thought this was a good example of why you want to consider how big are the prints in your thing. And that's especially true if you're doing novelty prints or if you're doing any kind of fussy cutting. And we will get into fussy cutting later. So my next one, I consider this successful, even though it's not fantastic as far as scale goes. My next one, this was actually just a pillow project that I did, and I used this Jingle Bell fabric, and I had this center motif, and I wanted to use it. I actually stitched the wrong size, so I thought, well, I'm going to use that and make a cute little pillow. So I did that and used my center block. So I used, this has got a little Swiss dot in it, so I knew I wanted to repeat that in the border around the outside of the pillow. And then I've got a green, a lime green that matches well with these jingle bells. And then I use the jingle bells on these 4 places. Now, the jingle bells are a great scale for this. However, they're so far apart that for these little bitty blocks, it doesn't show up great. And so they look a little awkward, but it's a cute project anyway. But where it wasn't successful was I used a different fabric, this, for the back, and I used that in the 4 corners. And the corner blocks, because they're cut, it just really chopped those circles right on up. And to me, I don't consider that very successful. But it's a good example, and it's still a cute pillow. But I just wanted to give you some ideas about scale and how that can affect what you're quilting. This will be part of my beginning quilter series, and so we will have some others about fuzzy cutting and things like that coming up soon. And it just gives you a way to think about, what's your scale? Does it look like when you cut it? How will it look? That is something to consider anytime that you're planning a quilting project. Thanks for watching. I hope that you will like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. Please give it a thumbs up and tell your friends. I would love to answer any questions that you have regarding scale and how to maybe make a judgment of whether something is the appropriate scale for the size of blocks that you have. Because you can see, even in, for example, this block here, this patch, versus this patch here, they're the same fabric, but they look very dramatically different if you compare the two to one another. Same thing, this fabric where you can see several whole flowers versus this one where all you get is stems, because I think this has probably started out life as a 2.5 inch block, and this one probably started out as a 3. Again, if you have any questions or comments, go ahead and post them below, and I'd be happy to answer. Thank you, and have a good day. Bye-bye.